Okay, I'm just going to start by asking a few of our panelists a couple of questions, and then I'm going to open up all have lots of questions you want to cover. So my first question is directed particularly to the writing folks on the panel. So Erin, Julian, and also Alyssa. And it comes from the Council of Writing Program Administrators, and they're thinking about AI and what that means for the teaching of writing. So how might student writing be productively complemented, supplemented, or assisted by AI generators? And how can this happen in ways that do not preempt student learning? You want to start?
So my courses typically have, like many of ours, research projects that involve only writing. And I've redesigned my courses extensively during COVID. I see in a sense that the whole AI situation is sort of a COVID version 2, in the sense that it's causing us to really react very quickly and rethink at the basics, how we conduct our, we design our courses, how we deliver them. And so what I tend to do now is I have all my projects be multiple stages where we go back and forth periodically. And I teach them online, primarily using Canvas, even if the class itself is not entirely online. So I do kind of multiple stage projects around engaging with the student work at multiple points. And at certain points, there's no problem. For example, help augment their writing. There are other points that are very clear that it's not appropriate. In fact, I had a student tell me the other day, she said one of her, these are seniors, one of her high school friends had said, why don't you use ChatGPT in that class, in Kilker's class? And she said, well, I can't really because of the way the assignments are designed. It's really tough to do that. So I'd be happy to talk more about that later on.
Yeah, I think to sort of build off of like specific places in the writing process that ChatGPT can be helpful. In particular, I think in sort of the brainstorming, like organizing process. So I think that could be like helping to kind of think about what ideas do I want to consider for this paper. Yeah, how might I sort of approach this project? But also I think I even sort of use it at times just to sort of be like, okay, how do I write X kind of paper or an X kind of genre? And it gives sort of step-by-step instructions. I mean, you know, obviously the assignment prompt maybe differs a little bit, but that could be a helpful starting point for a student who hasn't written in this particular genre or this particular discipline before. And also, I think for some genres, probably not all, but for some, having a model, I've kind of played around with things like fraud applications, personal statements, things like that. And it often spits out examples that at least tick all of the boxes, right? I mean, there's not really a voice or a persona, you know, from the writer there, obviously, but it kind of sets up, oh, okay, here are the moves that a writer would want to make when writing this. So it could be used sort of to be a jumping off point in terms of the structure or organization for the student.
Alyssa, I thought of you in particular because of the utility of ChatGPT in creating literature reviews, which is something that graduate students have to do for master's or PhD thesis.
Yeah, thanks, Denise. So my first, I think, response to this would be to encourage everyone to download the tool themselves, particularly as it pertains to graduate curriculum. It's a different animal. And this is largely because it's so writing intensive at every step of the process. So absolutely, to your point, in terms of literature reviews, in terms of things like annotated bibliographies, in terms of things like comprehensive exams, at every step throughout many graduate programs, it's writing intensive, and the deliverable is in fact supposed to be individual, right? It's supposed to be an individual production. Where it becomes interesting is I think that in some instances, and I've done this myself, I have put so many queries into ChatGPT. I think in some instances you get something back that is fairly spot on. And so I think it's important to remember that it's not a one size fits all. For some very niche disciplines or topics or queries, it is going to be clear, just as my colleagues have just indicated, that this is not a comprehensive answer. So at the graduate level, anyone reading this can understand, ideally the students themselves would realize that this is not comprehensive, and this is not actually a reflection of the expertise that they are expected to demonstrate, the mastery that they are expected to have on this topic. In other instances, you would be very surprised at the caliber of work that is produced. And this is just my own reflections. This is my own personal kind of response, but in highly technical writing, which is in some kind of broad concepts, particularly in STEM disciplines that you need to have, highly technical writing is very easy to actually reproduce with ChatGPT. So you don't have the same narrative style, you don't have the same voice as was just indicated. A lot of like basic biological processes, you don't really need that voice for that narrative, right? And so that's where it becomes tricky. And that's where it is incumbent on, I think, the professor, whether this is in a seminar, whether this is whatever the assignment is for, it becomes incumbent upon the professor to be thinking about ways to ask students to produce this information, knowing that they may be able to type something into ChatGPT. So it's some of the responsibility is indeed on faculty to be thinking about their curriculum, which was just stated. But at the graduate level, it's a different animal. And I think it is also, so for faculty that are worried about this, I just want to assure you that if you're a grad student, that again, just my position, your graduate student has the ability to type something into ChatGPT and tweak it enough that it fools their major advisor that this was an independent contribution, that means they do actually potentially have mastery of that subject because they've gone in and they've modified and they've added citations and they've moved things around and restructured it. So then it becomes a very different conversation as to whether or not you are comfortable with them using that as their starting point or not. So that is a very different part of the dialogue than whether or not students can do it. I assure you they will do it. I assure you they are doing it. And I think most of us have yet to pick that up. So when it comes to things like literature reviews, that's going to be much harder. And not necessarily ChatGPT, but other types of artificial intelligence do have the capabilities to do things like embed citations, where they pulled things. And then the student has to go through and say, okay, USA Today is probably not a citation that my professor is going to allow in this piece, right? And so there is, it has to be iterative even to be passable at the graduate level. So just to throw that out there.
Right, I guess there's also the fear that students will turn to ChatGPT or a similar tool first, instead of doing the work, that's the student learning, right? How do they master the literature in the field if they're using this tool to generate?
Right, and they may use that tool first. And I think that there really isn't anything at this point barring them from using that tool first. And I'm not convinced at the kind of curricular level how we would determine whether a student has turned there first. So I think it's also just thinking about course assignments in a grad course versus things like comprehensive exams. And those are very different. Those are highly variable across units. So what the structure is in place, the length, the duration, whether you have an internet locked computer or not. I mean, all of this stuff is really variable. And so I think it's very discipline specific how much original writing you are asking for in these performative spaces, as opposed to, so it really, if you have more questions about a particular comprehensive exam or literature review assignment, the grad college is happy to talk through ways in which you might be able to change the prompt or how you are assigning this to your student in a way where you are aware that this may be a tool that your students are using and kind of get right with it, because I don't think it's going anywhere. So for us to push back really strongly, I think I don't think would be necessarily the right move, because there's no way to really monitor this at this point. But I could be wrong. I will look to my experts to my right and left.
We're looking to you.
Oh, we're going to say that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this space there are no experts, because we're all learning together.
If I could add something. So I think I'm no expert by any means in this, but I've played around a little bit. I think there are a couple of other concerns here, especially when you're talking about a literature review. And that is the current contemporary nature, the lag time between what's in the database and the research that's being pushed out the door. So I think that's one piece. And the second piece, I forgot already.
Okay, well, I can riff off the first one
Oh.
and maybe, wait, do you have the second one?
I do,
Okay, go
I
ahead.
do. It's the accuracy of
Right.
what comes back. And, some folks have already indicated that, what you should do is download this tool and play around with it. And I would second that suggestion. And it would be interesting if you try to do some research on yourself. You might find you have a PhD from an institution you never attended. I do. So it's sort of interesting relative to the information that comes back.
I think that's true. And I think that there's a lot of variation in terms of fidelity of content, depending on the question asked and depending on the discipline. And I think that's important, is that in some instances, you might actually be able to use this to your advantage as a graduate student. And in other instances, it's not actually going to be useful at all, because what it spits back is not, you don't want to turn that into your advisor, and they know that. And I want to make one final point about differentiating between demonstration and mastery of content, which is, I think, what Denise is talking about in terms of things like literature review, is one way that ChatGPT might be useful. Generation of original ideas and being able to thread that, talking about theoretical paradigms in a rich and very detailed and nuanced way is not something yet that I have seen any AI be able to do. And we do expect our graduate students to be able to do that. So if you're asking them to talk about which theoretical paradigm they're using in XYZ, that is a bit so what you are asking your students to do, this goes back to the curricular point, what you are asking your students to demonstrate, I think, is where you can make some of those.
Yeah, Julian.
I said a quick question.
Yes.
If ChatGPT is encouraging us to think about what we're doing at the graduate level, the requirements are for graduate education, does that also suggest perhaps that we can adopt some of those at the undergraduate level as well?
I hope
If
so.
ChatGPT is not as sophisticated at handling this.
I think so. And I think that what this also means, whether this makes us, whether this brings a certain level of discomfort or not, I think this means that we have to adjust our pedagogical strategies, and we have to take time and energy and attention in thinking about our curriculum. And I think I'll just speak, I'll make I statements. I have been using the same materials in one way or another. I refresh my course materials regularly, but if you're teaching an intro level course, these are the same concepts that you're going to be, there's not a lot that's really going to change that often in a 100 level course. You would make tweaks, right? You make tweaks, but perhaps the way that you are asking your students to perform or how you are engaging in recitation of material needs to change. So maybe not even necessarily the way your didactic lectures change, but what you're asking students to return. So one example for me and this is just one example, that as I moved away from a final paper in one of our 400 level courses, and I moved to the unessay. I know it's becoming really popular as a tool across a lot of institutions, but it was extraordinary because it is by definition, you cannot use any artificial intelligence to generate anything because it is an unessay, and it involved public speaking for those who are less comfortable doing that in front of a class, because I also want to be very sensitive to that. Many of them created a piece of artwork or generated a report in a different way, or went out and did a community-based project and then shared information on that. So there are other ways to do it, but it does require a more heavy lift on the faculty side. And so I think we also need to be mindful of how much time that will take. And I know we have a faculty senate representative here, and it's a lot to redo your course in order to be thinking about this stuff is something that takes time. And you do have to be, really mindful about what that means also. But I think that's part of it is figuring out how to structure your time to change, not necessarily perhaps what you're teaching, but what you're asking students to do in response to what you're teaching.
So my next question is for the design folks, Josh, Ian, and Julian, anyone else can chime in, but how will these AI tools be used in the workplace in your field in the future, and how can we prepare students for that workplace?
Jump in. So in architecture, we're really nervous about these things too. So there's these, text to image generators. It's like having this sort of design tool on your smartphone and an app in the pocket 24/7, right? So, I guess one of the things that we try to do is sort of think about these as a creative medium. Like, how do we begin to actually use these? Again, the word used, I think Julian was augment, right? I think that's a really important word. I think anybody that just tries to lift a generated essay or generated image off, just basically made the case that they're redundant, can be replicated by a machine. And so I think that's the question. How can these things actually be thinking of our intellect, right? How do they begin to challenge and extend our imaginations? How can they be devil's advocate? Whether if you're stuck writing, how to get you unstuck, or challenge your preconceptions, or make you think about a project or problem in a different way. Sorry, I'm like really congested, but I just heard the sort of conversation. I would say, like higher level, I think the university should really rethink how we deliver and how we really sort of think about knowledge. At this point, this is like the greatest opportunity since the Enlightenment to just sort of rethink and put ourselves out there and say, we are really important, right? I mean, I look at this and say, there's deep fakes. How do we discern what's true, what's not? How do we look at biases? Look at how we look at the training data, look at how we, there are really reasonable fears based off of, I think, concerns that have to do with ethics, how humans and machines work together or don't work together. If higher ed doesn't step up and fill that role, then who will? Nobody will, right? So I think we're at a crossroads where we really need to radically rethink perhaps what we do. And I completely agree. At the lower level, it's, it can come down to assignment versus assignment, or what are we asking for? But I will say in my design, so we're talking about ChatGPT, how it's become an augmenter rather than a crutch, right, for our students. Conversely, when we were designing in studio, I actually have my students doing a Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, some of those latent diffusion models that you probably saw up there, the language models that you based off of text prompt. And what's fascinating is the first time ever that I've had design architecture students not only write willingly, but then iterate their writing as they get these images, and then they're constantly getting the thesaurus out and trying to write descriptively, decisively about atmospherics, materials, effects, right? Sort of not only what the edifice would be, but how people would feel in that edifice. What are the, and so it's actually, I think, kind of phenomenal in a way to sort of expand the way we think. We can take advantage of that. I think higher ed will can establish itself as not only relevant, but super, super important. Right?
I 100% agree with that. We've all encountered the narrative in news media, across popular culture in America that the value of higher education is questionable, and this is a major opportunity for us to say, sure, AI can give you all of the information that's ever been available on a particular topic, but we as as professors, make the experience of that information human. We challenge students to encounter that information in critical ways and to connect it to their own lived experience and to make sense of it. And that's really the value. So if we can figure out how to do that and make that apparent to the world, that's an incredible opportunity for us, I think.
I'll say too, I fully agree with everything. I'm not an AI expert. I do econometrics, so I understand a lot of the mathematics and whatnot. And the one thing that strikes me is it doesn't yet discover. So the real value of us academics is not just that personal connection, but discover that knowledge that future iterations will be trained on in terms of the AI. And I've embraced it. So the economist in me is this is a technological disruption that allows us to specialize, right? Some of the more mundane things we can outsource to the AI, and we can really hone in our skills in a specialized way. And so I make my students, so I don't call it this, but we talk about econometric concepts, and they have to read a paper and effectively write a referee report about this paper that they've read that uses these topics. I make them use ChatGPT for their first draft. And I make them turn in, I want to see what prompts did you use to generate that draft? What does that draft look like? And then I want to see a final draft that you have made your own, understanding the notion of academic integrity, plagiarism, etc. And I will tell you, and I think a lot of people have touched on it, it's way cool. It's a way cool technology, but it is, you have to have some domain of expertise to know what to ask it to get anything useful out of it. So it's not something that is just going to supplant. And with some of these things too, and again, the personal side of this, you know, I try to distinguish with my students, there's this idea of being an applied economist and an applied econometrician versus a pure crass empiricist, right? Pure crass empiricism will be replaced because these are just algorithmic steps. The machine doesn't care what data you throw in to spit out results. The machine doesn't fundamentally defend sort of underlying assumptions, doesn't take a stance on what, you know, true data generated analysis looks like. This is where the human element cannot be replaced yet. We'll discover we still make decisions. Important, I think, to train our students again to use this. It's not going anywhere.
Using this as an opportunity about our value, but our value and our role in society is incredibly important. I would add that one of the things that concerns me a little bit is I think our responsibility to bring these into our courses, to help our students engage with them, to discuss them. I'm sort of thinking of revisiting the digital divide issues that we talked about in the past, about access to hardware, access to the internet and resources in terms of this AI divide, because how do we incorporate these into classes if people are not yet used to using them? How do we pay for using them? Classes getting access to the latest tools often involves paying for them, essentially on some early beta tester list. And how do we do that in an equitable manner? How do we engage with these things and prepare our students appropriately and also learn ourselves as well? So for me, I think revisiting that issue.
Thank you so much for this trend, this kind of shift in direction, because I think it's really important. And I think for graduate education in particular, it speaks to the innovation that we expect to see in our students and in our mentees. So this is one of the reasons I think there is a big difference in terms of graduate and undergraduate curriculum when you're asking your students to produce. And I think it can be very, very powerful. And I do think that it can augment and that human innovation piece, and I think you just articulated it beautifully. That human innovation piece is what we expect to see produced at the graduate level. But there are ways to engage in a positive way. So rather than having this fear and kind of negativity that seems to be what's emerging out of the higher ed space, I do think we have an opportunity to change that narrative and redirect it into something that's positive. I don't know if anyone has done this, but you can actually put your syllabus into some generators and it will create an original piece of artwork for you for your syllabus based on all the readings that you've done. It's really fun. And so there are ways to make this a positive. There are ways to engage that I think can help our teaching and can help our scholarship, right, quite frankly. And so I think that this is at all levels. I think this is a really important point to talk about.
I'm gonna take a minute and open up the questions if anybody has anything pressing.
Learning from, I'll pick an author, Jane Austen, is crucial to a liberal education. Learning from ChatGPT about Jane Austen is not the same as learning directly from a wonderful writer. How many handstands do I have to do to get the students to read Jane Austen directly?
I think you assign Jane Austen and have them read it. You know?
No, but I can't make them read it when they can.
But I think there's an argument to be made that for authentic assessment, because ChatGPT can summarize a Jane Austen novel for the student. Could even give them some, some references to criticisms of Jane Austen's work and can give a lot of information about it. But if we ask students, how does what you read in this novel connect to your own experience? Or how did you feel about what this character did? Or, there are a whole array of different ways that you can tap into that human element through authentic assessment that AI can't deliver for the student.
But then they'll tell me how they feel about what ChatGPT told them about that character. I mean, starting from the ground zero is crucial to a liberal education.
If I could add on to that, because I do think authentic assessment is going to be a huge part of supporting this, but it goes back to a lot, I think, of academic integrity issues and helping students understand the difference between just getting a good grade and why they're learning what they need to learn. And I think, in just doing a little bit of the research, because I think we all are reading 2 or 3 articles a day, and something published in January is already old hat on this topic. But I do think taking the time to explain the why of the assignment, is every student going to be inspired to do it because it's the right thing to do, or for that learning? No, but we have that now. But I do think this is going to be a big part of it. ChatGPT, or actually all of the AI, be it Bard, being any of them out there, they're a synthetic minor of a lot of the information that's already out there right now too. So I think part of it is that why and what your response to it, not a combination of everybody else's response to it. And I mean, some students get it. Do a significant number of students get it? I still believe yes. I still have to believe those are here for the right reasons too. Are we always going to have students that are not going to? Of course. But for me, I mean, if we can't explain the why of pretty much anything we're doing, might warrant a revisiting. Why are we assigning it to begin with?
Can I ask a quick question? How did you handle Cliff Notes before we were talking about ChatGPT? So how did you get them to read Jane Austen before these tools came?
It's a long-standing problem. But
Headstanding problem.
So now instead of 3 cartwheels, I have to turn 4 or 5.
I just want to piggyback on this worry or concern with the different levels. We talked a lot about graduate level, where people actually care about, people going to graduate school because they care about the subject that they're trying to study, or even, let's say, major upper division classes. Our gen ed classes are filled with students that don't care about being in that classroom and are okay with getting a D+ because that's going to give them gen ed credit and they don't have to see that subject ever again. And I don't, they're not going to engage with the work. This is not an opportunity for them to even learn something about it. It is, I'm going to have the computer do it and then just hand it in. And if I get caught, maybe there's a problem, but if I don't get caught, then I've completed the essay on this essay exam, or I was able to turn in this paper that is the term paper for the class. And I see some huge issues for gen ed across the board. And students, we remind them in our first year seminars, students, we tell them that gen ed's important. I mean, liberal arts is important, that you're a whole rounded citizen. And as a political scientist, we kind of beat that drum that you got to be knowledgeable about a wide range of things. And students are like, I'm just here to get a degree and I just need a D+ to do that, or need to do that.
So I think there are some opportunities for some structures, some pedagogy that would limit students' opportunities to use these tools. If that's the concern. So for example, using a flipped classroom model where they are producing responses in real time in front of you in the classroom. So they're writing right there, or they're having active discussions with you and each other right there. And some of the other types of assignments online or to non-class meeting time. I think we're going to see more and more of that, particularly in writing intensive disciplines, just for that very reason.
And I know it's been said before, but I can't encourage, I guess, strong enough that instructors, every instructor from first semester GA to the most tenured faculty needs to take that time, to acquaint themselves with it, because our students are using it and learning it. We have to be acquainted with it as well. But take the time to have that discussion with the students again. What are the appropriate uses? Because from discipline to discipline, there are going to be some wonderful applications, others not so much. And again, the difference between undergrad and grad. And so is it going to take more work? Sure, with every new technology, that's change. And we change, or I forget what the exact saying is, but you know what I'm trying to say. So I would really just encourage those departments and the instructors to say, okay, how's this going to work in my class? How am I going to address it and make sure that the students in my class know what my expectations are? Sometimes we're going to work on this together. It's a great teaching tool. Others, here's maybe what you can use it for. Here's what you can't use it for. But I think that part of that is just to, I think part of it is, I'd rather hear it trusting our students that they're there for the right reason and that they do want to learn, even if it is a off major gen ed topic. And so I think part of that is just, if we start with that, there's so much that we can use this for positive. And here's some ways that you're not doing yourselves any favors. That's, at least for me, heading in the right direction of making sure they know how they can use it and how they can't.
So first of all, I find it really inspiring that you're really thinking at a very high level, radically rethinking what we're doing in a classroom, communicating what we do in higher education, and supporting what's going on in the world by maybe using higher education to make this and other tools better. Something I'm hearing a lot, of course, from all of you is that all these opportunities, they're going to take time, right? And this time is, for the intents and purposes of an R1 institution, right now it's essentially invisible labor. Because for an R1 institution, what matters, at least what matters in terms of merit pay, what matters in terms of tenure and promotion is not so much the teaching, right? It's not that the teaching isn't important, and we recognize that, and we do put in the effort. But how can this now invisible labor of rethinking how can we make that visible? How can we make it really count within our institution and our goals as an R1
It's a
institution?
good point. I mean, I was talking to someone else earlier and the point that if I write a book chapter and it comes out 6 months later, it's obsolete already. In this space, it's like lightning speed, right? Whereas I actually get a lot more traction within my discipline when I'm on a YouTube video with 7 other experts from around the world and we talk for an hour and it gets like 80,000 hits, like within a week, right? You know, like nobody read my journal article. It's not 80,000 people, right? Seriously, nobody reads architectural journal articles. One person, the author, the author's mother, reviewer 1, 2, and 3, right? Like, and maybe an editor somewhere, right? So, yeah, I mean, to me, the sort of way we track the impact, you know, again, that can actually change. And it's really hard to sort of think about default metrics and, you know, how they can be tracked rigorously. But in my discipline, like real metrics aren't really, how do I say this? Scholarly metrics in architecture are not really tracked very rigorously either. And so I can actually track, let's say, my Instagram engagement a lot more rigorously and down to a discrete number than I can, let's say, Community of Science or these other tools that for my scholarly work, right?
And so in other words, the work that you have done in this particular space, and I know that, I mean, you do international workshops, right? The work that you do in this space has had a great impact, but it's not countable in a way that's right now
Well, I still
recognized,
put all the metrics on there, like, you know, if it's, you know, the top ranked YouTube video on this channel, right? Or, you know, I actually listed for the first time ever in my report a bunch of alt metrics on, you know, research gates, you know, like I was the most read in my department for 50 weeks out of 52. I don't know what happened those 2 weeks, but whatever. You know, Instagram engagement, I mean, I had like 1,000 followers, then suddenly I had 50,000 followers, which is more than UNLV has actually. You know, so it's those sorts of things. It's like demonstrate the trajectory at least, right? Like, you know, something big is happening here and higher ed needs to tap into it. And that's at the local level, that's my only way of sort of trying to convince, you know, directors and deans of that, right? So.
You know, anecdotally too, with all the cases that come into our, not all, a big chunk of the cases that come into our office, that topic will come up. My instructor doesn't really care about teaching, all they care about is getting published, or the instructor says the reverse. And I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but it's wonderful to be an R1 institution. It's wonderful to want to ascribe to have 40,000 students somewhere in the future. But to do that, are we going to need to also rethink how we equally value teaching and service and reward them for that?
What a thought, Phil.
Teaching has got to be important.
Erin, I think it's important to think too about why students are using like terms of ChatGPT and other ways that they cheat or plagiarize or things like that. And I think there's certainly going to be the moments where I don't care about this class, it doesn't matter, I'm just going to do it, right? But I think there are also times where students are overwhelmed, right? And whether it's something, you know, that they have procrastinated until the last minute, or whether there are, you know, divergences that are impacting the ways that they're coming to the work that they're trying to do, whether it's issues they have at home or at work or in other classes. So I think there is something to be said too, just about making sure that we are carving out space and support in our classes for students to be able to come to us when they have concerns, when they feel like they're lost, when they feel like they're running out of time, those kinds of things. And also I think kind of going back to assignments and assessments, making sure that things are really clear and really laid out, and that, you know, we're on a weekly basis reminding them, hey, this deadline's coming up. You maybe should have done X, Y, and Z by this point. in part because I think in particular for undergraduate students who maybe are in a gen ed class that's really different from their major classes, the expectations that instructors have are very different, and the kind of work that they're doing might be very different and might take a different amount of time or a different skill that they don't quite recognize yet that they don't have the way they think they might. So I, being really conscious of, okay, nobody's coming to my office hours, well, how can students get in touch with me in different ways more accessible for them? Instead of making them find my office, which, is hidden in the middle of some desert complex or something. But being able to recognize that these might be some of the reasons that students are turning to AI or other sources that we prefer not, how we can open up space to make sure that they feel safe and comfortable articulating when they're struggling, and that we're gonna support them through that.
We have a question online. I've heard often that we don't teach students to write. How can these AI tools be leveraged to help students become stronger writers? Any thoughts about writing?
I'll jump in here. I think in the first year seminar, as you were saying, one of the main struggles I can have is getting students to feel engaged with the coursework that they're doing and helping them feel like it matters, and that's building onto what they're going to be doing in their major courses as scaffolding and skills that they'll be using throughout their academic careers and hopefully beyond. I think something that I've experienced in the last couple of semesters is students feeling self-conscious about their writing. I've had 2 students this semester tell me that they were embarrassed to use the writing center because they felt like their writing wasn't good enough, or that they were laughed at, and I know that's a common experience, especially for a lot of first-year students who are not confident in their writing skills, and a lot of them don't even feel confident in their ability to produce original ideas. And that is something that I think ChatGPT specifically can assist with in a way where I liked what you were mentioning about having them produce work through ChatGPT and then showing it to you and then having them revise it more originally. I think that that's something that could be really useful to implement in more first-year classes specifically as a way to get them more comfortable with the iterative process and creating work on their own. And I'm hopeful that it could also help them gain confidence in asking for that help that they so often do need.
Yes, can I jump in really quickly on the graduate level for that question? I have a colleague, not at this institution, who for over a year now has been using, almost 2 years, has been using AI and asks graduate students in a seminar to, first the query gets reviewed. So to your point, the query gets reviewed and then they actually have to critique the response. So their job is to critique the response using the most contemporary approaches and whatever that discipline is. And that is the assignment. And I do think that that speaks to the critical thinking skills and well, the writing skills, but the critical thinking skills that were in that fantastic comment by Layla that was online. I hope everyone had time to read that, got a couple of +1s, but I do think that that can help in the grad space to really teach critical thinking skills. It's one example of, I'm sure, dozens and dozens we could come up with.
The next question is about academic misconduct. So how are we going to protect students? How are we going to protect students from false accusations of plagiarism, cheating related to AI? We're already seeing classes repeating student work into inaccurate AI detectors. Then is launching or has launched their own tool for detecting AI. What will the process be to adjudicate these disputes? How can we make sure it's fair to the student and to the faculty?
There's a couple questions in there.
Yeah.
One is that I would say really like any report of alleged academic misconduct, the more information it makes it to our office or that we can gain during the better. But also just briefly on this topic of AI detectors, First of all, they're changing daily. You know, it's as quick as somebody generates new AI, there's going to be another company that's generating some sort of detection device. And just like Crittenden is not a plagiarism detector, it detects original work and you still have to look at it. So some of these AI detectors, which again, I'm sure we'll have new conversations about in the near future, it could be a jumping off point, and that's about it in terms of, well, okay, this seems like it's highly likely that it came from AI, but that's not where you'd stop. And I don't think that's where you'd stop with any detection device. You know, there are lots of other things to look for. And first of all, I would also hope that nobody starts with that punitive response. I think it's an opportunity for a conversation, even asking the student, hey, did you use ChatGPT? Why? You know, are there things, because again, it might be okay in some classes, but you know, there are other ways that faculty even in the past have used that could still be applicable in terms of asking a student, well, what do you mean by this? You know, if you wrote this whole article on this and you just wrote it, I mean, what you mean? They should be able to speak to it. You know, things like unnatural or awkward phrasing, repetitive content. There's a lot of different things that the faculty member can still do in a follow-up conversation with a student to try to determine, is this more likely than not? So, you know, and I think that like some other topics, I don't want this to be approached of automatically assuming a student's dishonest and cheating. It could be that maybe they used it or misused it. It could be they've done something else, but without that discussion, not a lot of learning is going to happen. And even if a student made a mistake low level, we can still address it low level from an educational standpoint and talk about how can we use this? If you have a concern, how do we address that concern? I can promise you almost every academic misconduct case we've got, I don't think I want to have the total number I've adjudicated, but I know it's in the thousands. Is that, you know, there's always underlying reasons too. It's not just that the student didn't like a topic or just, you know, it could be everything from terrible home life to perfection. We have a 90 in this class. I need a 98. I mean, and everything in between. So from that, for me, that's a starting point. And it could be a good discussion starter, but there's a lot more information that we would hope in our working with the instructor and the student both, that both feel like they're being heard, treated fairly, and we arrive at hopefully what happened and how we can best resolve it. I hope that helps.
I think too, in terms of this idea of protecting students from you know, potentially false claims or overzealous claims that they've used AI inappropriately. It all starts with as much clarity on your own policies in your own class as you can possibly provide for students. So in your syllabus, be as clear as possible about the ways that it's okay to use AI in your assignments, the ways it's not okay, or if it's not okay at all, ever. Be very clear about that. And you know, the more we can help students to understand what our expectations are, the more likely they are to, at least most of the time, conform to those.
And to that point, I 100% agree with that, but also I think there's a huge difference in accusing students of being dishonest and having conversation about a concern in this assignment they submitted. Sometimes just even how that discussion starts can be a world of difference in the students' comfort level of talking about how we got to where it is. So not everything has to come from that point of even, you know, I guess protecting everyone involved still, it can still be a low level productive conversation. It doesn't have to start with you're a cheater, because that's honestly rarely the case.
Right. And to Laurel's note that it's important to be really clear in your syllabus about what your expectations are and what you think is appropriate use of these tools or not. We do have an online, a Canvas class with resources devoted to AI, and we have some sample language in there that you can adapt to for your syllabus.
And that's all linked from the handout that I shared with y'all online and that you all have. So yes.
I just wanted to piggyback on something Phil said that was, and come back to a very excellent point that was made earlier, that was about digital divide, but I just wanted to make sure that we don't lose sight. We had a very comprehensive basic needs survey administered to both grad students and undergrads last year. And the number is burned into my brain, and I'm hoping to burn it into yours. 54% of our student body, that includes grads and undergrads, go without one basic need every week. Things like basic hygiene kits, access to technology, reliable transportation, adequate food, and reliable, safe housing. 54% is a big number. We also know, based on a series of surveys that we administered at the university, that during COVID, the majority of our students were taking their courses on their phones, at least for part of the time. So I think it's important to remember that our students have a lot going on. And in many ways, they really are trying to do their best, whatever that means. And so I just wanted to thank Phil for bringing that up, and then thank you earlier for making the point about digital divide, because I do think we have to keep that in our minds, and we have to be thinking about equity and student needs.
Thanks. I wanted to do a shout out actually to the faculty center. You were asking earlier, Yvonne, about how to get a higher profile for teaching and support for the hard work that we all do in this realm. I think the faculty center is a critical resource, and I'm just so thrilled to see so many people here today. It's probably the most I've seen at most of the events that I've been to at the faculty center. And a shout out to Alyssa as well for putting this on. Also, the idea of doing spirit teaching that we have every year, where people are trying to synthesize their knowledge about teaching practices and present them to the community. This is such a valuable resource. It's our higher. I think something like that should be supported, celebrated, carried further, and I hope it continues. In the faculty center that we do more, but it's great to see so many people here about this topic. I hope this discussion can continue in this venue and also.
So I've been listening and learning and thinking about our colleagues who aren't able to be here because they're working multiple jobs, maybe teaching right now. There's a few classes going on Friday morning. And thinking about in particular our graduate teaching assistants and our part-time folks who are patching it all together. And I would say that 52% might well apply to a lot of our colleagues as well. So how can we as an organization incentivize, reward, value, compensate those colleagues for the time it's going to take to learn these things, rethink the way they're assessing our students and designing their assignments, and taking the time to have these conversations with our students. I really challenge us as an organization to put our money where our mouths are and where our good intentions are, and carve out a little bit of their workload assignment to do these things. Because I know part-time instructors love teaching because they're not doing it to get wealthy. They have an incentive to do this work that is intrinsic, and how can we help them make the time for this kind of good, necessary work? And I don't have the answer to that.
Excellent question.
And I think doing this is what keeps the value of the college degree in the long run from depreciating. It's difficult to justify in the short term when the rewards are for getting the next article out. But if we don't do it, our reputation in the public will continue to suffer.
I can't speak to the faculty side directly, but I can speak to the graduate assistant side. But I would to the point you made at the top of the comment. I took my staff recently to visit the food pantry on campus because we have so many graduate students who are in need that we're taking kind of field trips around campus to all of the places so that we can see ourselves what is happening in these spaces. And I learned from the amazing bevy of volunteers who work at the food pantry that we have a lot of graduate assistants faculty, staff, and PTIs who use the food pantry weekly. So just throwing a big shout out to the food pantry, if anyone from there is watching, because the work they're doing is amazing. So that's the first point I wanted to make. And the second is that faculty and residents are FER colleagues. I just want to really acknowledge right now how much work they are doing in addition to the PTIs, because I think it is often, that is where a lot of our frontline workers are. So just to say that, but on the GA side, we are hoping that GA stipends will be increasing. We are hoping for good news from the state legislature. We are, I mean, crossing my fingers, toes, eyes, like we're in very close communication with PTSA. We're working really hard to answer any question the budgetary committee sends to the grad college and get back right away. We're really hoping for good news in that space. But that doesn't speak to what you're talking about. So one thing the grad college is planning on rolling out next year is dedicated support for GAs. We're actually in communication with the College of Education right now for how we can have flex structures for GAs to get resources they need. So weekend offerings, evening offerings, asynchronous offerings, ways that GAs can get that teaching support and course, kind of even course design assistance. But just another reminder that GAs should not be the instructor of record, building an entire course from the ground up as part of their GA work. It should always be done in consultation with faculty assisting that.
And also, I think part of what you're asking, I don't want to be repetitive, but I think part of it has to go back for academic and administrative faculty, both in terms of, we probably do need to rethink how our job descriptions are there, how we are evaluated for promotion and merit. And you know, it's one of those things that right now, again, I'll just speak to the administrative, a few of us in the room. You know, merit's a tremendously inequitable and actually probably creates more animosity amongst folks than a sense of collegialism. So it's just one of those things where I think, are these going to be difficult discussions? Yeah, but again, the students, this is a technology that's changing, and if we are going to keep up as being the best faculty, again, academic or administrative, and preparing our students to be the best candidates in their field, how can we achieve that if we're not willing to have those difficult discussions and change maybe some of our practices and policies too? So, I mean, that's why I was kind of joking. You said you don't have an answer. So that's an excellent question, because I do think part of it is we have to accept that maybe some of our current practices are kind of broken or at least not updated.
So I am not the provost and but to the workload piece, I think one thing that we can all do as we're investing time in this space is assure that your supervisor is aware of your commitment and your time commitment. You do, academic faculty do have the opportunity to have workload reassignments, right? So if your supervisor does not know how much time you are investing in upscaling your skills, then how will they be able to equitably give you an appropriate workload assignment? Just throw that out there for thought. And I did want to go back on the comment that Laurel made earlier about the importance of being very clear in your syllabi about your particular policies. And to take that the next step, you as an individual instructor or faculty member will have the autonomy to establish the criteria that you want. Do not expect this is going to come from the top down, because I can assure you it will not. You will still have your academic freedom to establish your interpretation of what is and is not appropriate for your classroom. But I'm not the provost.
I think the other thing to think about in terms of workload and equity is the opportunity that some of these tools provide to do some of the work that really is not a good use of your time and effort as a faculty member. So just as an example, I was asked to write a letter of recommendation for a colleague for an award. And I'll be honest, I used ChatGPT. I gave it the person's, I gave it a description of the award and the person's CV. And it gave me something that was about 80% accurate. And it took me about 10 minutes to edit it and I was done. So if you think about those kinds of things that eat up so much of our time and effort, or just the initial draft of a syllabus for a new course prep, those are opportunities where we shift some of that work off our plates so that we can engage in these, I think, frankly, more interesting kinds of intellectual effort around teaching and learning.
I think you just blew everybody's mind, Laurel.
Frankly, I think the opposite. I'd be furious if I found out that someone wrote a letter of recommendation for me, not authentically. So that's very concerning to me, frankly.
What do you mean by authentically?
With their own
The templates, with a Word doc, with, I mean.
the Word doc, come up with it on your own, right? And
How many of us copy and paste, at least to start with, something that we've written before?
The template.
Yeah.
it's still generated by you.
Something I've written before, not something ChatGPT wrote
Right,
for.
but it's multimodal. You can just feed it right in and have it write it in your voice. I mean, that's the thing. It's how does it augment what you're doing, all right? It's not.
Came from their CV.
Yeah,
It was absolutely,
Right, I mean,
I
you know,
edited it
To me,
for my voice.
to me, I'm
and I
not saying you're
corrected
wrong.
Things that I knew were inaccurate about that person. I also added some reflections on my own
Right.
personal
So
work.
I'm not saying you're
interactions
wrong, but I
with
wouldn't
that
say she's
person,
wrong,
but
right?
yeah, there's, I mean, a lot of that.
It's a good
that kind of
question. What makes us
letter is
human?
just Citing
I mean, that's the
the
thing.
things a person has done. And that's not a good use of my intellectual effort, I don't think.
That really actually is getting to the heart of what what's challenging about this is what constitutes intellectual effort, I guess, and what constitutes an authentic voice, and why do we do these things? Why do we write letters of recommendation? And why do we ask students to write essays? I mean, let's kind of circle back to a comment you made, Laurel, about asking students to do authentic assessments in response to texts like Jane Austen. I want to push back on that a little bit because I did play with ChatGPT a little bit. I asked it to write a literacy narrative, which is a pretty common English 101 assignment. It wrote a literacy narrative, right? ChatGPT will write in response to a prompt that's asking students to write from personal experience. Right, it wrote a little thing about, I went to the library and read Harry Potter, and I mean, it was obviously fictitious, but it will generate those responses, and so if the ChatGPT can do it, then what's the purpose of asking students to do it, right? There is a purpose for that. It's a communicative purpose, and I think when somebody asks for a letter of recommendation, maybe they're relying on, I want this person's attention on my career for the space of the half an hour it takes them to write the letter. That's what maybe their personal expectation is. It's a personal commitment, so that, is maybe why it would be upsetting for that person to find out that it was written by this AI.
Especially if it's for a teaching award.
So this is slightly different, but in the kind of vein of what Denise just said, I don't know how many people followed the news yesterday and heard about the new Drake song.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I feel like that's relevant in this space because fans are really divided. So AI took I guess all of the kind of artistic style of Drake, the artist, and then auto-generated his voice and created a brand new song with brand new content. And some fans loved it and some fans were furious because it sounded like Drake in the style of Drake's work, topically accurate.
I bet Drake was here.
Drake is suing. So I don't know, in terms of some copyright law, the folks who actually sent it out into the world. So anyway, I just, not that that's directly related, but I think that Laurel put her finger on something that is exactly what we're talking about. This is exactly where we are.
Yeah, why do
So-
we do what we do? Yeah, that's the question, yeah.
I think this brings up a really good point, because we are now talking about ChatGPT. Our freshmen are going to be using ChatGPT. By the time they graduate, they will be using AA 429.7. A completely different world will have different accuracies and different outputs. And this is something we need to be ready for. I don't know how we can be. Are we working toward it?
Well, I think one thing that I've done in my first year seminar, I had students do an activity this semester where I gave them 2 essays, one generated by ChatGPT and one an actual essay from the previous semester. And I asked them a series of questions about identifying the authentic, or if we want to use that word, versus the AI generated. And the second question I asked them was, how did you know if it was written by a person or not? And a lot of the students got it wrong. Only about 40% of students identified the student-written essay, and about a third of the students who misidentified the student essay said that they could tell it was a more authentic voice and that it felt like it was written from personal experience, which was the opposite, right? And so while that was concerning to me in a way, it did open the opportunity for larger discussion about what's the need to have authentic voice. Why is it important to write in your own voice? How do you find your own voice in writing? And I think that, I don't think there's any easy answers to these questions, but I think that having these discussions in the classroom, in first year classes specifically, I think is a really good place to start. Because I agree with you completely, by the time these students graduate, things that happened 3 months ago are irrelevant. 4 years from now, who knows? So.
Actually, if I could speak to that a little bit, I knew I had an answer in here somewhat. Like almost any other technology, experts do get developed in the field. And so there may be people that are, technology, educational technology delivery experts. And so, one of the things that was listed as a potential productive use was new courses specifically designed for working with these AI generators, because not only will they likely be demanded in the job market, but these are our colleagues in that we can also look to, just like in almost any other technology. As things grow and change, we're not expected to be an expert on everything, but hopefully we might know who to reach out to try to keep updated or best as well as we can. So that might be one thing, is that we're a big public university. My guess is we're going to have a few technology experts that will probably be part of their PDQ, staying up with it.
Julian.
Yeah, we're going to come back, Jenna, to your point about Drake. I mean, this technology, the controversies about it are all about labor. Whether who's creating it, who's participating in it, who's getting credit for it. We haven't talked about intellectual property issues yet, patents, and so on and so forth. But we are all engaging with it because the very act of using it, we're part of the training data set building by engaging with it. So we're participating in the process. And we're going to come back to I guess the point that the question you'd asked, and Josh's point early on about our role, coming back to the idea of the role of the university, the role of scholars and academics. This is ultimately a question about how we handle change. And traditionally, academic institutions have been relatively slow moving, relatively conservative, for good reasons, and perhaps not so good reasons in terms of handling. And this is a challenge to us to think about how we sort of meta up, how we go up a level, and think about how we handle change, respond to it, and look at ourselves in that process. So I think that's absolutely critical that we engage with that discussion. Yeah, so challenge, absolutely.
Maybe the next time we have one of these discussions, we should bring in a lawyer or two related to some of these issues. We're really not getting that perspective, and I think we need it.
Yes, yeah, I mean, and you know, we have a big panel, and we did, you know, we did not
No, you
include
did
anyone from
great.
law school, but yeah, it's
You did
definitely
great.
a huge topic.
If I could, half of my knowledge of what we've been talking about, my limited knowledge, I should say, because like everyone else, we're very new to this, is from a colleague who is a lawyer. And I think we actually invited him to be on this panel, and he basically,
be here.
he couldn't be here, but he's been engaging in the best journalistic practices of interviewing ChatGPT over a period of months. And the discussions that he's been forwarding to me have been absolutely fascinating. So yeah, I totally agree that having somebody.
I would almost go as far to say in some of our task force discussions, I mean, this was meant kind of as a welcome. And I could probably make an argument for about 10 follow-up sessions, really specified to almost each of our areas of specificity.
Yeah, I mean, we can kind of scratch the surface of all of the things that we've been talking about. I wanted to ask a question about the potential malicious uses of AI that have also been getting a lot of attention in the media, you know, misinformation generation, including fake citations, deep fakes, things like that. And I think this gets to one of the concepts we talked about the use of the university and the standing of the university. How should we be addressing to students how to recognize malicious uses of AI, or how to handle it or counter it when they encounter it?
Not to crack. But that problem's been just accelerated, right, by stuff.
It's an excuse to be a better researcher, essentially go deeper. If you're looking at an image, look at the metadata. It's who generated it, and it was who generated where things to be generated.
What the world needs now more than anything else is a liberal arts education. That's a call to arms.
And, you know, something else that I've encountered both within conduct, but also because I work with the university support team, the student concern program, however you know it. But as students are engaging with AI, they're not just engaging with it for purely academic research or to help write their papers. You know, it'll do a lot of things. It'll have conversations with students. And so to that knowledge, or, you know, to that point too, of how do they recognize, you know, what's real, what's not. You know, and another point that I thought was really important is we do need to take the time to train our students in AI literacy, what to look for that's both accurate, but also we're seeing a lot of mental health risks that are coming out of this, because some students start seeing these responses, and if we don't remind them that, you know, these chatbots really are nothing but, you know, they don't have any sanctions or reasoning, and that they're synthetic interactions, that sometimes they still seem real to students. And depending on what question a student puts in, they can get back a really cold and sensitive response. And we're seeing some tremendously negative mental health impacts on students from what they're interpreting as a reliable source. So, I mean, the training for us, how to productively use it or prevent its poor use, but also just, again, training students. It's across, it kind of goes back to, you know, there's so many things our students are dealing with. And certainly the mental health challenges are pretty first and foremost on a lot of our days.
Anybody?
A follow-up comment on that. I've been watching and listening to see if anybody is gendering the tool and giving it a persona. And I haven't detected that yet. And I'm very impressed, and I'm wondering, could you speak to whether you kind of had to go through a process of depersonifying the tool's output as you were playing with it and exploring its utility? Did any of you like slip into that and then pull yourselves back? Or are there any strategies to help people not, you know,
I think
think of it as a co-author with a personality and feelings? The way that it's trained to generate text is in a human manner, which builds connection.
You're generating great questions that we're gonna have to go back and now.
Yeah, a lot of that, the AI tools that we've been trained on, like Alexa and Siri, are gendered female.
They were given to us gendered.
Right,
So I think that it's also personal motivation to gender things. I mean, I think this is also sometimes a bit of the user potentially. I don't know. I'm sure it will be. I'm sure it will be soon.
I don't know if anybody read, there's a piece in the New York Times, now it's been probably almost 2 months ago. And I apologize, I don't remember who wrote it, but the journalist had engaged in this very long and detailed conversation with, I think it was the Bing AI, and the responses as they evolved from the AI over time were deeply disturbing, gendered. The responses eventually became gendered and like really almost with features of a personality disorder.
Frightening is a good word.
Yeah.
So everybody's worst fears realized, imagined.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember these language tools are trained on, what they call large language models, which they scraped the internet and all the text that's available on the internet. And so built into that is all of the problematic interactions people have been having on Reddit for 2 decades. That's what's training these tools. So it's potentially deeply disturbing. That gets to, the questions of the biases that are built into these tools because they've been trained on publicly available text. So, yeah, first question.
I was just gonna say, there's a YouTube clip right now of Katie Couric and Brian Gumbel talking about the internet from 1994. And what is this internet and how does it work? Where were we in 1994 when that came out? What were we thinking then? So there is a potential, it's like anything else. It's a lighter. It's good if you're gonna light your stove. It's bad if you're gonna light your neighbor's house on fire, right? So I think that there's potential either way for this, and I think that the most important thing is looking at the future and how much the internet has changed from 1994 to now, that we can probably consider that this is gonna have that same effect and that same ripple effect.
Hopefully, a quick question. This is a follow-up to the point I made earlier about inviting a lawyer on the panel. I wonder if there are other voices the panel feels should be on the panel, maybe including students, both graduate and undergraduate, and GAs. So on.
On the task force, I don't think he can make it.
Right, yeah. Scramble to find a day.
Are there other voices that you think might be missing or should be?
Students, yes, students, although I would say on the grad student side, we have a lot of students who are really concerned about retaliation in a lot of public spaces, which is actually, I'm learning, one of the reasons we don't have a lot of grad students come to this stuff. So if we have grad students who are using any AI, it may not be super comfortable in a public forum like this talking about it. So I would just want to advocate on that side for our grad students in those spaces. But yes, I do think opinions in general, as long as we don't, just the way that we engage students so that they feel safe in this space to share their experience, I think, but yes, absolutely. I think voices should be included in all of this.
For some recent alums, they wouldn't be so nervous perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there are people right now who are doing research on how AI is being used in the workplace, but that.
What I really hope to see is if this was again, like a welcome springboard and from some of the excellent questions and comments of probably to do each topic justice is really maybe creating more of a series, and that way, people have specific legal concerns or specific concerns, they can participate in those. And I do all that. I'm just discovering this amazing facility, so I'm thinking of ways I can try to use it more. But that's what I almost would like to see, as opposed to like maybe another, which this has been great, but really breaking it into almost like a series of in-depth topics where people can go deep on a topic that they're really interested in.
I'd like to speak up for using AI as a way of augmenting what we do. To your point, Laurel, of the writing of the recommendation. as you were talking, I was remembering that I have to write a recommendation today, and it's something that's very templated, right? I know that you described like being disturbed that, you know, an AI had written it and then you had changed it. But I almost thought that we really have to advocate for what is the best tool for getting the job done in the best way possible for the best outcome. So I was actually thinking for myself, for the student that I'm writing this recommendation for me actually not to use a tool like ChatGPT as a very first draft in order to see what's a really strong recommendation is actually doing a disservice to my student. Because then I can see, okay, so what is like a really good recommendation and how can I augment this recommendation? So I actually think that it could be something that's really valuable, you know, for all of us and for our students for our own work.
But I think one of the concerns that I have on that front is, you know, when people discover that, it only takes you 2 minutes to write like a letter of recommendation because you're using this tool, then there's going to be a sort of an arms race. Okay, now instead of asking for 3 recommendations, I'm going to ask for 10, and everyone's just going to have to be doing more of this, you know. And it's kind of analogous to, you know, professors maybe using these tools to speed up their research output. There was an article about the Spanish researcher that was writing an article every 36 hours because he was using ChatGPT. So now you got people using AI to write articles that are going to be read by the AI so that you're outputting more articles. And, you know, again, it's like, why are we doing this? You know, why are we doing these things?
Yeah, Provost, so to get back to your question earlier about writing letters in response to it, in Provost, I think the Atlantic wrote an article about this recently, calls it the death of the recommendation letter. And so I'm wondering if we follow up on this, that maybe people are no longer exchanging recommendation letters, but rather the prompts that we use to generate them. That'd be very succinct, like prompt engineering. But he does point out that he used ChatGPT to write a generic letter for a student that he really wanted to write a good letter for, and then he wrote an anti-letter. He basically used that to look at what would be sort of a generic formal letter for a student prize. Then he wrote an anti-letter, and this is, you know, an anecdote, but the student eventually got in based on the very personal, very heartfelt letter that he was able to write. It was the opposite of what
yeah, so that's a different use of the tool if the idea is to have it produce a better product, great, that's great. But if the goal is to speed up our efficiency, if that's the end to the means to the end, then we are just sacrificing humanity at the altar of just efficiency and capitalism and neoliberalism. And then it's just like the nuance is lost on the public, it's lost on the legislature, it's lost on everything. And then higher education is pointless. But if it's to make better products, if it's to augment, enhance, that's something I can kind of get on board with. That is to be determined, I think, still, however.
It's back to the genre argument. He was using it to identify the cliches, the genre, the typical constructions. But you're right, nuance is something that is difficult to explain by definition.
I want AI to grade my papers.
Well, yeah, then if you're doing that, why are you criticizing the students? for
Right,
using
and no,
AI?
I'm just, yeah.
Then we're all just using AI.
Yeah. Parts of our jobs are not fun, but have to be done by ourselves. Yeah.
How about adding an IT person to the panel, or a computer scientist?
So we did in our task force or working group or whatever we're calling ourselves, have some representatives from OIT and also a graduate student whose area of study is AI models.
I know that several people here, they know large language models fairly well, so they can probably speak to any questions that you may have about the technology behind it. It doesn't take a computer programmer to understand what's happening with the large language models and how they're trained.
Could you locate a mental health professional with the time to and the expertise in dealing, I would just say, look for somebody who's good at helping people navigate manipulative relationships. Because I think the way that we react to these text generators is equivalent to being in a manipulative relationship when it goes south. And there's probably a better technical term for that, but that might be a really good panel to have about how do you help people negotiate these things? And they've been harmed by them. Just like one of
Any other online questions? No, I do have one like small anecdote to share. We haven't really talked about like citing ChatGPT, like should you say, or should we ask students to say, like, here's how I used it? So I'll just tell you all that I have a daughter in 4th grade and she just spent 3 weeks on standardized testing. And she decided she wanted to write a petition against standardized testing in elementary schools. So we used ChatGPT to write a letter to our Assemblywoman, Leslie Cohen. And ChatGPT wrote us a nice 5-paragraph essay with like 3 reasons why standardized testing is not great for elementary school students. And then my daughter personalized it and like added her own reasons, and she got 30 signatures. And then under her signature in really tiny type, she wanted to add, I used ChatGPT to write this, just so our Assemblywoman knows, that's where it comes from. So I guess that's just like a future consideration too, think about how do we ask our students to say how they generate it.
Go back a little bit to instructors making their expectations clear, because I think it's hard to cite AI, no real author.
Does the style manual have it?
No.
Not probably,
Yeah.
not yet.
It's
Right.
also iterative, so you can put the same query in and you
Right.
won't actually get the same response.
Right.
And so it's also, there's a temporal component that makes citation challenging.
So I think one of the things that an instructor can do, and we tell students every time we do a presentation, if you don't remember anything about a presentation, please remember these 3 words, ask the instructor. So again, it's how do you want a student to give credit where credit is due? Even if it's just somehow letting them know, hey, I'm trying to use this as like, yeah, there may not be a way to cite it, but there may be a way to give appropriate attribution that it was part of your research.
Artists often reveal the media that they're using. And sometimes you mention software that you've used to run a calculation. I would argue that this is more like a piece of software that you're using. And that it would be important perhaps to note the version of it, because that will, and the date that you used it, because that would be a clue to what the heck it was trained on at that time when you had access to it.
Use the search terms you used.
Yeah, the prompt, whoever suggested including the prompts used in the assignment is brilliant.
Yes, yeah. One last question.
Boston University, I just read this morning, they had a policy for this. And one of the things that they are doing is that a student has to provide all the prompts and the interaction that they have as an appendix to the work. And they have to put there so the instructor knows what comes from where. So that depends on how much you can allow or how it is used, but at least you have an idea. If they do it, you have an idea of what comes from there, how the student work with the text.
I want to quickly, once again, plug the Canvas shell. Yvonne,
So Kevin Sebastian and Lindsay Erdem, do you guys want to just briefly talk about the resources that you worked so hard to create, and that can be really helpful. Yeah, keeping this conversation going and including this kind of work in your classes.
Sure. So thank you everyone for this very rich conversation. And like Phil said, this is sort of like kind of us kind of diving into this very important topic. I was wondering, Melissa, if we can actually take a look at the Canvas shell so I can point a few resources. Yes, you can, the link to self-enroll into the course is on the agenda. And we also have a bit.ly for it, so bit.ly/UNLVAI. And this is very much sort of a work in progress, and there's a mechanism by which you can also provide feedback, so we know what sorts of things you might want to see in this Canvas shell. So in the modules, a few different things that you can peruse. But one thing that I think is important to look at is sort of, in order for us to understand sort of the impact and implication of all of these generators, we kind of also have to learn how AI works, so kind of working on our own AI literacy. And so there are a few free online courses here that were developed by the University of Helsinki, which you can access. So lots of cool resources to learn about how AI works. And this is something that you can also share with your students. There's also a course about ethics of AI. So we're familiarizing ourselves to sort of the implications, larger ethical implications of AI. And then another great resource is this one, AI for Anyone, which is a nonprofit organization that has all of these other tools that you can look at to learn about AI. A few other things that we'd like to kind of focus on. Oh, and I do want to mention too that thank you for the guidance around the committee, task force / working group, whatever it is that we're calling ourselves. And also to Leila Barati from the Writing Center, who gave really good feedback on the Canvas course itself. So thank you, Leila, who also offered a really nice thought in the chat in Zoom. A few other things too, there's some readings and resources here categorized thematically, which you can also access through this spreadsheet as well. A few things that I'd like to particularly call our attention to is AI and diversity. So some of the conversations earlier about toxicity and sort of the responses that you get from AI. So this is one recent scholarly article about prompting ChatGPT and how that can come about. The whiplash. And then finally, ideas for developing AI-related activities. So some considerations for faculty. We also have a poster from the recent Best Practices Expo. Two of our colleagues have created a poster that's full of ideas for how to use AI and other sample assignments and activities as well. And then finally, we have a Google form here that you can use to provide us with feedback, again, to guide sort of where we might take this Canvas course and the larger conversation about AI and higher education. So we highly encourage you to self-enroll into the Canvas course. So bit.ly/UNLVAI, and it's on the agenda. What was that? On the I think, what do we think about students accessing the Canvas course?
Faculty, I mean, it's self-enroll, so probably anybody can enroll. Maybe this is like primarily for faculty, I would say.
And then maybe the faculty can share the resources, whichever one they might find is appropriate.
Student version would be useful too.
Great.
Definitely need separate avenues.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, Laurel, is it Rebel Ready Week? Was there going to be a session on the AI and that?
Yeah, so I think actually our colleagues in libraries are planning some sessions for that.
Question about that. So is this self-enroll course, is this something that faculty can do to get those badges or whatever those, those kind of certifications? Because again, if faculty are going to invest a bunch of time, like it'd be cool to put that like on our, our annual review or things like that. So can it do that, or will it?
I think you would have to connect with online education and see how great idea too.
It sure looks worthy of it. You guys.
Yeah, it looks pretty good.
All right, thanks. I know we've gone over time. Oh, Lindsay.
I just wanted to take your attention for just a moment, just to highlight the resource that we had prepared. It's an instructor guide. It was prepared back in January, so kind of ancient right now. No, I'm kidding. Still a lot of things very relevant to what's the conversation held today. A lot of the ideas, potential applications and resources. You can read through the document and kind of think about the conversation today and make your own informed decisions. I think this is a rapid changing tool. My colleague likes to say, this is the worst we will ever see this tool or these tools at today, right? So they're only continuously growing, and it's going to be interesting to see how this progresses in academia and society as a whole. So thank you all. I won't take any more of your time. I appreciate the panelists. Thank you so much for attending, and have a great evening.
I was thinking about like, so nice.